down a little after the day after that, is Thornley's testimony. And reading this first, you can then see more clearly than you otherwise could that it is a total fabrication. That doesn't need any more. That takes care of that. Let's see if I can dispose of the other document. Let's see if I can dispose of the other document just as briefly. It is important for you
Jim, by the way, I'm going to record this.
Sure.
Let the record state he said sure.
We're talking about a rough summing up of the Kerry Thornley. It's not the entire case because I don't have my basic file here, but what we've developed and put together from other files just in the last week or so, as well as information he's given us, puts Kerry Thornley into an interesting perspective. And just for the benefit of whoever, whatever you're going to do with that, that's the purpose of this summary. Now, the second thing that we don't have to go into in any detail now, but that you should read carefully on your own, is this gratuitous affidavit that Kerry Thornley gave me. That's very important. After you've read that and learned that the man is a pathological liar in the service of some clandestine operation, quite apparently connected with assassination, you will then get quite a bit out of reading his 50-page affidavit. Now, in order for the affidavit to be meaningful to you, I have to add one more thing. We won't go into it now because that would just take time. It is important to understand, as you see the rambling in the affidavit, that this guy, although I would say there were slight signs of his being a bit upset, he wasn't happy at being called to the grand jury when they called him, was basically very cool. He, looking back, I would say, considering his relative youth, he had to have been pretty well coached by a lawyer because he was not at all concerned about any exposure or risks. He felt he would carry the day, and usually a layman witness is ill at ease in a grand jury unless he's had some lawyer really assure him that there's nothing to worry about. After all, a district attorney has a degree of control of the grand jury, and this guy's a stranger in there without a lawyer. No, you find when you read that, that's one of the interesting things. He explained in the grand jury that the Spanish, which he gave us an eloquent sample of, he learned in college. But I found out again that he just, looking through that, he had 1 year of college. And there's no way the kind of Spanish you get in 1 year of college to be able to talk. You can read a little and that's it. Anyway, the point I'm making there is he was very cool, very organized, very much in control of himself in front of the grand jury, even though we knew he was lying. He did not know we knew he was lying because he did not know the statements we had obtained, the statements, for example, that indicated that he had been in Oswald's company here in New Orleans. Again, he told the lie. He told the Warren Commission. He repeated the lie and said, no, he didn't know he was in New Orleans at the same time as Oswald. He had no idea. And by that time, as I think you know, we had also talked to enough neighbors of the Oswalds down on Magazine Street to learn that they had seen Thornley. They picked his picture out immediately. ignoring Oswald, pick Thornley's out. And I'd say at least 2, perhaps 3 different neighbors, where they thought he was Oswald because they would see him with Marina frequently going to the Winn-Dixie store. And so that and a few other things became the basis for a perjury charge afterwards. But as to the grand jury appearance, he was very cool and would have charmed the jury, except I think before we called him in, we had read some of those statements to them and they knew he was lying. Now, the point I'm making there is that when you read that 50-page gratuitous affidavit, which he gave me last year when I was speaking in Georgia, you'll see what is distinct deterioration, the rambling. It becomes almost incoherent. The story he attempts to put on me is almost unbalanced. In other words, the thrust of it, as you will see, is Mr. Garrison, I'm no longer mad at you. I realize that you had reasons for thinking I was involved, and it's clear to me now. But I did come across some things while I was in New Orleans that may be useful to you, and I should pass it on. And with that lead in, he then gives me a story that no child would attempt to sell anybody. Some Nazis that he bumps into. They're not just ultra-conservatives, they're Nazis. And he overhears some of their plans to kill the president. And perhaps he should have reported that to me earlier instead of waiting so long. In other words, it's totally and utterly impossible. And in between are his ramblings. So as you see that, you must understand this is not the same Thornley as as the Warren Commission is encountering in April of '64. Nor is it the same cool Kerry Thornley that we are questioning in, I think, somewhere around '78. He has now begun some form of deterioration, and I would judge it has a great deal to do with the things he did in 1963, because you'd have to be really pathological to live with if he's done what I feel he's done. One more comment about the 50-page affidavit. The way it developed was I was speaking at Georgia State University, and just before the speech, the man who was going to introduce me said, you remember Kerry Thornley, don't you? Yes. Well, he'd like very much to speak to you. He's here. You mean he's a student here? Well, not exactly a student. He was a student, but he dropped out. But he hangs around the campus, and he knows a lot of people, and he's very interested in talking to you. He says it's most important. And I said, in my usual tactful way, I said, you can send this message to Mr. Thornley. Tell him that the only reason I dropped the charge against him was because I decided that if they were going to let Clay Shaw go, then we may as well forget about prosecuting the smaller people. But I am perfectly aware of what he did in 1963. Very tactful message, one of my chief virtues, which probably didn't exactly do his psyche too much good to begin with. Well, when I finished making my speech, the young master of ceremonies is driving me back to the hotel, and he hands me an envelope and said, Kerry said he's sorry you wouldn't meet with him, but he anticipated that, and in recent weeks he's put together this affidavit because he wants you to try and understand his position or something like that. So I said, well, I'll read it. And I read it that night, and realized two things. Incidentally, in passing, as we drove away from the auditorium, he said, "Oh, incidentally, there goes Kerry." And the last time I'd seen him, although, as you've seen from the pictures, which is the large picture of him with a woman that's standing up. You got that?
No, I don't have that one.
Well, anyway, you've seen it. He's very thin. Almost, he was very thin, but he wasn't noticeably sloppy. His hair was a little on the long side, but just in the sense of being full. I found myself looking at a beatnik of the lowest order. His hair, which was kind of a blonde, was now more of a reddish blonde and dirty appearing, and hung all the way down to his shoulders, but not combed, as if he hadn't combed it in days. He really, and he was also sartorially a mess. There's nothing wrong with blue jeans, but he was just plain sloppy and dirty looking. As a matter of fact, my immediate reaction, comparing him for the last time I saw him, even though he was casually dressed, was that he must be on drugs, because to let himself deteriorate so physically and in appearance. And I have no reason to change that impression. You know, some people, when they're fooling with pills and get far enough on pills, start getting awful sloppy because they're using downers at night, and then they're using the uppers, and pretty soon they become messes. You've seen, I'm sure, pretty girls become literally unattractive. Well, in that case, there's that kind of physical deterioration too. So I went through this thing afterwards, this 50-page affidavit, and decided it was potentially useful. I was struck by the admissions he unconsciously made, which I'll now summarize, but I was more struck when I re-examined it a few months ago and realized that it was more of a document than he intended to give me. Now, let me summarize just in this one-page memo I have, which I gave Garrison along with the 50-page affidavit from Thornley. I have, do you have a copy of this?
No, I don't have any.
Yeah, it's in that, the copy.
I thought I gave one to everybody. Here, I have one extra one right here. No, that's a different.
Wait, this is in the Thornley file now?
Yeah, it should be. No, I've had everything we produced by now in the Thornley file, so we have common files. You'll find it. But anyway, it says, Ray, 1976 affidavit of Kerry Thornley. In particular, Ray, going to the substance of it, Bannister, Ferry, Mexico City, and Rosselli. And for the record, in case anybody has to follow up, I might add that his address, as far as determinable, is Georgia State University in Atlanta. It's in the city, and he is a dropout who doesn't seem to work, because I asked the fellow what he did. He just hangs around the university, which means, looking back, you recall that after the Warren Commission, he immediately left Washington and proceeded to an unusual school out west. So that was 1964. So that means he's now in his 13th year of college. And not even going to classes.
Did he have any previous ties to Georgia or the Atlanta area that you recall?
None at all. He's from California, literally from Whittier. That's where his parents live. And don't forget that his father's a photo engraver. That could be something to keep in mind when you're looking for one. It might be from an intelligence family. He went to school at Southern California, as you'll see in there, for 1 year. And as I recall, because of the incidents of young men coming in about that time, there were indications that some of the intelligence agencies were doing campus recruiting in the late 50s. And perhaps he was picked up at that time. In passing, it occurs to me that I think Gordon Novell was going to Southern California at just about the same time. And he ends up being a part of the same apparatus, but with a totally different assignment. Mostly, in his case, electronics and the bunker incident. Now, Thornley admits in the course of this, in between the paragraphs in which he's trying to convince me that he's innocent of involvement in assassination and that certain Nazis really were back of it, he makes these admissions. First, that he arrived in New Orleans in early '61. The Bay of Pigs occurred in April 1961. New Orleans, this is continuing my brief analysis which I initially made for Gate and Fonzie of 50-page affidavit. New Orleans was used as a logistical base, I should add logistical and intelligence base and training area for anti-Castro activities by U.S. intelligence in the early 60s. Example, the attempted purchase of a Ford pickup truck, that's at Bolton Ford, in Oswald's name while he was still in Russia. The training of anti-Castro guerrillas north of Lake Pontchartrain. I've come across some additional information this morning on that, but I haven't had a chance to get to it. I think referring to the location of another camp and another group of Cubans. If I can't get to it before you leave, I'll put it in the mail the next day or so. So that would be 2 camps located. Only, here's what he gives us. Oh, here's what we learned, and I added at this point. He's given us in the memo that he arrived in New Orleans in effect before the Bay of Pigs, apparently to join the apparatus and servicing it. And it would have been useful because his Spanish seems to be fluent. We know from our earlier investigation of Kerry Thornley, since we long regarded him as a significant figure, that he departed from New Orleans for Arlington, Virginia, to await his testimony in Washington before the Warren Commission. I have December 1963. That would be because it's in his statement, but the statement of Jack Spencer, which I will come to in a few minutes, has him departing much earlier than that. It has him departing literally days after the assassination for the Washington area. In New Orleans in 1961, according to the affidavit, Thornley, quote, accidentally meets Guy Bannister and discusses with him the book he's writing about Lee Oswald. This is the first of a series of encounters which are entirely too coincidental to be happening to Kerry Thornley, especially when you add to it the great coincidental encounter initially with Lee Harvey Oswald. In 1962, Thornley accidentally meets David Ferry. Quote from his affidavit, I'm nearly sure that no significant conversation transpired, unquote. In September of '63, Thornley visits Mexico City. Quote, example from the affidavit, for many years I had wanted to visit Mexico City. 5. Also in September '63, Thornley is in New Orleans during the same period Oswald was. Later he says, I began to realize that others might have good reason for suspecting me of being part of an assassination conspiracy, unquote. That's the understatement of the year. 6. From 1964 until June of 66, Thornley, and it admits in his affidavit, worked at Glen Towers Apartments in Los Angeles, where he got to know a gentleman named John Rosselli, who happened to live there. He mentions that they have conversations speculating about the assassination. At this point, I should say that back in 1976, when Thornley gave me this, John Rosselli had not been murdered yet, and quite apparently in connection with the possibility of his being called as a witness in the assassination investigation. And when you add that to all the other encounters, Kerry Thornley has bumped into too many people. He may be the only man in the world who has accidentally met Lee Harvey Oswald, Guy Bannister, Dave Ferry, and John Rosselli. Now Thornley is, at the outset, the point about Thornley is that he is the leading candidate for what has been for years called the second Oswald. I think some of us for some years thought that perhaps there were several alternate Oswalds, obviously used to set Oswald up by scenarios they went through. But for whatever it's worth, my conclusion now is it would have been more economical to use one man and safer to use one man. And they probably did use one man. And I think there are good reasons for believing that one man was Kerry Thornley, which is probably not unrelated to the fact that if he did that, that would be a good reason for deteriorating in the way he seems to be doing. One of the significant lies that Thornley told in the Warren Commission, the biggest lie of all is, parenthetically, is his portrait of Oswald as a communist. That literally made him the communist. I earlier used the analogy to the keystone of the Roman arch that holds the rest of it together. Thornley's testimony is the testimony in the Warren Commission that makes Oswald a communist. The rest of it is so irrelevant. You have people like babysitters when he was 4 years old. Thornley is what the Warren Commission is built around. As a matter of fact, I gave you all a little while ago statements of other Marines that lived longer with him and closer to him in the Marines, and one after the other says that he was not communist-oriented in any way. But one of the most significant lies is Thornley's description of Oswald's height in his Warren Commission testimony. And this is very significant. They're both close to 5'11", to make that point. But it is almost impossible for a person who's 5'11" to think of another person who's 5'11" as being 6 inches shorter than him, needless to say. Yet in his description before the Warren Commission, he has Oswald as small as 5'5". He's asked by Jenner, was Oswald shorter than you? Oh, yes. Well, I suggest that that is clearly an attempt to disassociate himself from something. And what would he be disassociating from himself from here? From possible identification as the second Oswald. That, if he were, for example, that would be his chief concern, having to surface and testify. He wouldn't want that possibility to arise. Anyway, I compared their heights by...
Cliff, do you have this, and then I won't have to go through the whole thing if you got it? Okay, then I just scanned some
I don't think we
things.
have that.
I want you to have it
We
because...
have this one, but I don't believe we have that one.
Well, I'll
Let me run a copy.
okay. In cases like this, I'll just summarize it. But I've given exact citations, one after the other, so in order to show you I'm not speculating that Oswald's 5'11". One record after the other shows that he's 5'11". Then, somewhere along the line back in the 60s, in the preparation for questioning him before the grand jury, we had sent for his driving license in California. And we learned from the driving license that he's 5'11". So from the driving license of Kerry Thornley, we learned that he's approximately 5'11" and 150 pounds. And from the different marine examinations and passport documents and so forth of Lee Oswald, we learned that he is approximately 5'11" and 150 pounds. About as close as two different people can be. Okay, now that we've made that point, we go on and go into the...
1.5.
It feels like getting me a cup of hot coffee and beginning to...
If they have any.
Oh, yeah, well, I'd rather drink cold coffee than none, so don't empty it. You might ask the girl to bring it in. That reminds
Tell me
me.
if they have any coffee. I don't think they have coffee.
Oh, really?
Jim, can we hold just for a minute?
Sure.
Administrative details.
That those questions have been either handed to him before or asked to him before because he responds so readily. It's almost as if in some cases he answers, "Oh yes, I'm glad you brought that up because that leads to something else I wanted to say." And he not only underscores by repetition, but he comes in on Oswald's supposed communism, Marxism, or whatever from different angles, as well as his rabidity.
What do you think accounts for why he gave it a smaller height? He obviously knows
There's a very
about it.
clear reason for that, Cliff, and you were out of the room when I explained, and that's why I went to the trouble. Have you seen the authentication?
I just picked it up.
Well, I think there's only one reason in the world for that. Now, naturally, you're asking me to speculate, and I identify the speculation. But this is the kind of situation in which you could stick your thumb in your mouth and say, well, there's no evidence to show us why Thornley made this man, who was the same size as him, made him nearly 6 inches shorter. And that would be the end of it. But fortunately, there's an approach to a problem like this, which I described earlier as applying models. Now, if you apply in the total context of the situation in which Thornley appears, especially keeping in your mind the additional things we've learned about Thornley, his rather pathetic attempt with the long affidavit to get out of this thing that seems to be closing in on him. If you apply a model, the applicable model, to Thornley, I suggest that the most rational answer as to why this man who is 5'11" describes Oswald, who is the same height, as being nearly 6 inches shorter. The most rational answer is that he played the role of the second Oswald repeatedly. As you know, the guilty flee where no man pursues. Well, put yourself in the position, for the sake of argument, just to see what your response would be when you're asked about the height. Suppose you had participated in setting Oswald up, and so much so and so consistently, for example, from going to rifle ranges before the assassination, shooting at the target in the next lane so that they, with a man-liquor car cano, so they'll remember you the next day, going to downtown Lincoln Mercury and driving, I don't think they could have gone 60 there, but let's say 50 miles an hour or something like that, and announcing that you're Lee Oswald, and if they don't cooperate on the sales terms, well, you'll get a car in Russia. and having the salesman put down your name. The endless scenarios in Irving, going into the gun shop at Irving to have a gun fixed and leaving the name Oswald, and to the ultimate impersonation, which I suggest is going to turn out to be the two photographs of Oswald.